Hello, everyone. This is Robert Nicholson, host of The Deep Map, a weekly podcast from the Philos Project that explores the hidden religious and cultural dynamics driving headlines around the world. Another special episode focused on the conflict in Israel and Gaza. I'm very happy to be joined by my co-host, Dominique Hoffman. Hi, Dominique.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Robert.
And an old friend and distinguished gentleman and scholar, Dr. Marc LiVecche. Marc, thanks for being here.
Hi, Robert. No, thanks for having me. It's good to be in your presence again.
It's been a long time. I want to give a little bit of context for this episode, which will be focused on just war theory and its application to the conflict in Israel. As everybody knows, October 7th, massive atrocity, Hamas attack on Israel, many dead and wounded, hostages taken. And since then, Israel has responded through its military with a devastating series of airstrikes inside the Gaza Strip. And the question everyone's asking is this okay? Is Israel justified, whether under international law or under natural law, moral theory, the Western heritage, take your pick, Christian tradition, to defend itself in this manner? Or is it going too far? Now, we're still early in this conflict. We don't know how things will play out. But as of today, October 12th, we want to begin that conversation because as Christians, as human beings, human life is important, no matter where it is and to whom it belongs. And it is right and just that Christians and all people of conscience are asking these questions. Marc is a great expert. I'll give his bio here in a moment. And I think someone who's equipped to help us to begin thinking about that, or help us begin thinking about that, if I could put it that way. But first, before we get into that, Dominique, would you, just for everybody out there listening, just give a brief update as far as where things stand today?
Yeah, absolutely. So since our briefing, the death toll has gone up on both sides. So over 1,300 casualties of Israelis have been reported as of this morning. 25 are American. 17 missing British nationals are feared dead, including children. And the Palestinian authorities have released numbers that 1,400 Palestinians within Gaza have been killed and 6,000 injured. The injuries on the Israeli side the numbers remained around 3,000. This morning, the IDF also confirmed that they have identified 97 of the what was estimated to be 130 to 150 hostages taken back to Gaza. I think Israel's priority has been securing the hostages that were taken into Gaza. So negotiations have started on that. The international or the Western media has, we could talk about this a little later, has condemned Israel for shutting off the electricity, food, and water supply to Gaza. The condition for that being restored is the safe return of all hostages. We also now are getting a little bit more clarity from the Biden administration's response. It was a bit muddied in the first few days. Secretary Blinken just arrived on the ground, and the Biden administration has come out now after deleting some of its initial tweets and posts condemning Hamas and its terror, and is there to support Israel, which then, of course, has elicited the Arab world threatening the United States to not get involved. So we're seeing the potential for escalation.
The potential for escalation, no doubt. Ground zero for this war is the Gaza Strip, which for those who aren't looking at a map is a very small piece of land, about 25 miles long, that is located between Israel and Egypt, which controls the nearby Sinai Peninsula. There are over 2 million people in this land. There are a few hundred Christians They're naturally caught up in everything that's happening, not responsible for it, but nevertheless bearing the brunt of the effects. The vast majority, 99.9% of these people are Muslims, Sunni Muslims, who are, through Hamas, connected to other regional actors. Everybody's talked about Iran. Let's also mention Turkey, Hezbollah, and some others in Qatar and elsewhere. There are many supporters of Hamas inside Gaza, but not everyone inside Gaza supports Hamas, which of course elevates that humanitarian question even more. I want to get into that here with you, Marc. I'll read your bio quickly just so people have some sense of who you are, and then ask you maybe to fill in some of the gaps. You are, in fact, the McDonald Distinguished Scholar of Ethics, War, and Public Life at Providence Magazine. You're also a non-resident research fellow at the US Naval War College in the College of Leadership and Ethics. You've written a few books. Your first book was The Good Kill, Just War and Moral Injury, published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. You also co-edited a book with Eric Patterson, mutual friend of ours, Responsibility and Restraint, James Turner Johnson and the Just War Tradition. Right now you are perpetually finalizing, from what you've told me, another book called Moral Horror, with the provocative subtitle of A Just War Defense of Hiroshima. Marc, I want to ask you, before we get into the topic of just war and Israel, Gaza, how did you get into this work? How did you become a just war scholar?
Justifying my genetics and preternatural, predispositions. How did I get into it? I was a surprisingly happy child, Robert, for, as surprising as that might be given some of my book titles, but very cognizant early on of gross injustices in the world. I've often talked about one of my first memories being, I was probably 4 or 5 years old. I walked downstairs in our house in Detroit, Michigan. My dad was watching TV. I don't know if it was a black and white TV, if it was a black and white movie, but it was black and white. And on screen was a guy in chains. He had thick matted hair, big beard. He was doing some sort of backbreaking labor. And I realized he was, depending on which version of the movie he was watching, he was doing quarry work, or he was working in a galley of a ship. And the man was scary. And I asked my dad why he was in chains. And my dad said, well, he's a thief. And they caught him. And so in my little, 4-year-old universe, this made sense. You do bad, you get caught, you get punished. And so I said out loud, he's a bad man. And my dad, in my memory, looked at me as if to size me up and wondering if I could take what he was about to say. And he said, well, so maybe it's a little more complicated than that. He stole bread because his family was hungry, and he tried to feed them and he couldn't. Nobody would give him a job. He tried. So he broke a bakery store window to end his family's hunger, and they put him in prison for it. And I had what I still consider to be the first great intellectual response of my life. I burst into tears, and I went running from the room, went upstairs, crawled under my bed, snot coming out of my nose, the whole bit. And I knew the world was going to be unjust, and I knew that my father wouldn't always be able to save me from that. Fast forward, I'm a reasonably happy college kid. And for some strange, crazy reason, as an atheist, I decided I'm going to study the Holocaust, which I have since learned, I sometimes have to remind people, was the attempted annihilation of European Jewry by Hitler's Nazi regime in World War II. And I had no categories as an atheist to hate what the Nazis were doing, but I knew it was wrong. I knew I preferred what was right, and I wanted somebody to fix it. And that started a long path for me, including a path that eventually led to faith. And so maybe that's swimming against the current, but I became a Christian because of my study of overwhelming human evil. And Christianity was the only answer. The Hebraic tradition was the only answer that allowed me to understand why I hated it, why I preferred what ought to be instead of, what sometimes is. And it gave me grounds for demanding remedy. So here I am, I'm a Christian, I'm in Central Europe, That's another whole backstory we don't need to get into. But I started bringing friends up through Auschwitz-Birkenau and doing tours of the grounds of this former Nazi concentration camp. And I'm a young Christian, and I've got a lot of older Christians asking me what Christians are supposed to do about such things. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, we're pacifists after all. And this is a crisis for me. I'm Sicilian and Irish. I sometimes joke the only way you'd find a pacifist bone in my body is if I ate one. That's it. And so that started a long quest. What is actually the historic Christian response to political evil? And that led to this thing called just war tradition. And, from there, it began to answer questions. I guess the second important part of this is in the course of justifying the use of lethal force in moments of extreme in order to protect the innocent, to right injustices, or to punish evil. I also discovered that while there's justification for doing that, there's costs to doing it as well. And some of those costs are moral injuries that people suffer when they do grim things they would rather not have to do. And so this has become an obsession. We've talked before, Robert, that 51 years old and I've never served in uniform. I've never been in an existential fight. And to some degree now, I'm trying to pay back what I think I owe those who have stood on freedom's wall. And one of the things that I think I can help provide is some moral clarity as to what the business of warfighting really entails, how that can correspond to and be a manifestation of a Hebraic faith. So that's what has brought me here.
If I might ask, what is, the concept and theory of just war? So for our audience who might not have that academic background, how would you summarize your area of expertise and study?
Yeah. Maybe one of the first things I would say is that just war tradition is not just about war, not only about war. And what I mean by that is this. I think at heart, just war tradition is really a way of helping someone to think through how we ought to behave, how we ought to act when two or more moral goods or moral duties are in conflict. Right? So the conflict that's at the heart of just war would go something like this. I know I'm supposed to love my neighbor. And now I find myself in a situation in which one of my neighbors is unjustifiably kicking in the face of my other neighbor. Now, my problem is I've just been told and I've just submitted to the idea that I am supposed to love my neighbor. I'm supposed to love both, let's call him my enemy neighbor in this moment, but I'm also supposed to love the innocent neighbor, the victim neighbor. So this seems like a conundrum. What do I do? It's not enough for me to say, well, I'm going to love the victim neighbor now, and later when the smoke clears, I'm going to love my enemy neighbor again. That's insufficient. I'm supposed to love both of them right now. But it also seems true that I can't love both of them in exactly the same way, in exactly this moment, but I'm supposed to love them both. And so just war tradition helps think through crises like that. It is good not to harm another human being. It is good to protect an innocent neighbor who is being harmed by another human being. How do I think that through? And so just war tradition broadly has two major categories. They have fancy little Latin names, use ad bellum, which is just when is it right to fight? And then it has a second major category, use in bello, which is justice within war. So one category is when is it right to fight? The other category is how do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight? And each of those have subcategories. We can get into in the when is it right to fight category. There's a broad section that talks about duties. You have a duty to have a proper authority who declares war. A proper authority is just that person or that body over whom there's no one greater who's charged with the care of the political community. This person alone, for the sake of order, should be the one to declare war. Obviously, there should be a just cause. You should have a moral reason for doing this. And within the historic Hebraic tradition, there are three primary just causes. One of them is protect the innocent. The second is to right wrongs, take back things that have been wrongly taken, correct injustices. And then the third one is to punish evil. Those are the three major sort of causes for war. And then on the heels of that, the just war tradition asks that you have a right intent when going to war. And this is both internal. It's to orient maybe the heart of the war fighter. And it's to say you should be aimed at peace, ultimately. And peace can come in a couple of different ways. First, it's peace for the victim, right? It's protecting those who need to be protected. But ideally, one goes to war in order to overturn the just causes and to bring the enemy into a position where they could be welcomed back into the fellowship of nations. And so ultimately, and this isn't always up to us, the enemy always has a vote, but ultimately we go to war to have peace. You achieve that through victory in most cases, and this doesn't have to be victory on the scale of World War II. This could just be victory equals Assad, stop gassing your people. And if we have that, then that's sufficient for the day. On the heels of that, there are a bunch of prudential criteria that say, okay, look, you've got a duty to fight, but it might not be wise to fight. And so that asks us to look at things like proportionality, which comes, I think, into the present situation quite a bit. Are you more likely to do more good than harm if you launch this war? But I think you also have to ask the opposite. Are you likely to do more harm than good if you don't launch this war? You should have the probability of success, like before you start killing people and breaking things. Is there any chance at all that we're actually going to be able to achieve a victory that leads to peace, to rescue, those sorts of things? And then, of course, last resort, is this the last thing that we can try to do? Is this the best or only option on the table? And then when it gets into the conflict itself, there's categories that asks you to just moderate how you fight. These include proportionality again appears. And, so maybe the first one is a more strategic thing. When you consider how do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight, it just asks, is this particular tactic proportionate? Is it likely to lead to more good than harm? Is it likely to take you, one more step toward victory? And then within that, it asks you to discriminate, to separate fighters from non-fighters. The tradition asks that you only intentionally target fighters. You should never intentionally target non-fighters. And I'm using that word intention advisedly because that will come up in our conversations later. That's the tradition from sort of a broadly Christian perspective. And you should never say the just war tradition with a definite article, because there's several different traditions, one in international law, one within, maybe the Hebraic tradition. There's, and even within that, there's competing kinds of accents to it. But one other piece that I've started adding to it, and Robert referenced Eric Patterson, a friend of ours, he and I have put together another project that is on a term called military necessity. And in international law, you actually have necessity as a part of the criteria for how do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight. And it says you don't do anything unless it's necessary militarily, which on the one hand almost doesn't seem worth saying, but it becomes a question of stewardship. How do you use men and resources wisely? But it also becomes a bit of a spur. And if you discover that a particular battlefield action is necessary in helping you lead toward victory, then there's a very good chance, because that victory we've already established is just, there's a good chance that what is necessary militarily is also necessary morally. And then it should be balanced by proportionality and discrimination. So there's a lot there.
There's a lot there. And what I love about this tradition or set of traditions is that it informs something that I think is at the core of leadership, which is decision making. Some people talk about leadership in very expansive ways and talk about different characters and styles. And for me, leadership is just standing at the head of a line, getting the people behind you to the place that you all need to go. And how you get there and how you lead them are the important qualifications. Within both is this idea of decision making. What do you do when confronted with two bad options, right? The quintessential task of any leader. It's one of the things, you're referencing the Hebraic tradition. One of the things I love in the Hebrew Bible is the correlation between judging and leadership. You see the first iteration of political life for the people of Israel in the land of Israel is a polity under judges, right? People who are called lishpot, to judge between, feuds and to judge on, difficult questions, right? The story of Solomon and the baby, right? Trying to figure out, what do you do in this impossible situation? And what we're seeing in Gaza is an impossible situation, right? Hamas launches an attack. Israel launches a response. Hamas goes public, plays the victim, and posts photos of dead civilians. That's what's actually happening in Gaza. Israel has Israeli citizens, seemingly almost 200 people, in small babies, mind you, infants. I've seen pictures of the people who are there, everything from infants all the way up to grandmothers. They're in there somewhere. How do you find them? How do you degrade and destroy the leadership of Hamas without destroying your own citizens? It's an impossible situation. And I think what you're talking about is a kind of calculation to get to an answer. But here's the thing, Mark. There are people, and I've seen them on social media, Christians, people you and I would share many things with, who are saying, who would listen to you and say, dude, have you read the New Testament? Like, did you know that Jesus said, you turn the other cheek? Violence is always wrong. Peace is always the answer. We cannot participate. We cannot condone. We cannot support any kind of violence whatsoever. Violence is bad. Violence is itself evil and isn't justified when it's supposedly fighting evil. It's a very well-intentioned argument. I think it's made, for the most part, in good faith. Christians have, and I think have always had, some hesitation about power, right? It's not baked into Christian doctrine that, Jesus came, died, rose again. We build a state around that truth and an army to go with it, right? There's always this weird relationship between Jesus and Caesar, et cetera, et cetera. So for people like that, and I'm sure you encounter them all the time, people who say, you're off your rocker. You aren't even talking about Christianity, maybe the Old Testament, right, but that's not the new. What do you say?
Right. Yeah. I deny the basic fact that Jesus saved us from the Old Testament God, right? That's the attitude. There's the canon within the canon of the red letters. But frankly, and then this might be another conversation, but I'm even happy to go to the red letters and to illustrate the discrepancies in what our pacifist friends say and what Jesus actually said. If they want to go to the Sermon on the Mount, I'm thrilled to go to the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes end with blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be sons of God. And I don't have Hebrew, but I think I know enough about Semitic thought to understand that in the Hebrew, to say you're a son of God is to really say something. And it's to suggest that you bear the characteristics of the thing being signified. So a son of God bears the characteristics of God. So then you have to ask yourself, if the peacemakers bear the characteristics of God, what kind of peacemaker is God? And I don't see the pacifist argument illustrating the character of God that I see throughout the Bible, both in the Old and in the New Testament. So I that would be one reflection point. Another reflection point, and I don't want to suggest that orthodoxy has to bend to history or something like that, but I had alluded to going up through Auschwitz-Birkenau when I lived in Eastern Europe, and I happened to be there for the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Incidentally, and pointing to my age, I was just at the 75th anniversary not too long ago. But at the 50th anniversary, they began to read the names of all of the dead who were killed just in that one camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. They started reading the names. I toured the camp. I was there for a couple of hours. The names were still going on, just name after name after name after name. I walk away with a buddy. We'd go down the tracks, away from the gates, back into town, and then receding in the distance the whole while, just name after name after name after name. So we sit down in a Polish pub, pretty morally and emotionally exhausted from what we've just experienced. And we wondered how long that reading of names would take if they really did read every name. So we pulled out a napkin and a pencil, and there's an estimated 1.2 million souls that were consumed just at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And we estimated it probably would take a second to read each name. So we worked out that 1.2 million names at the rate of one a second would be 13.8 days.
Wow.
So 13.8 days of an endless litany of lost lives. And you're going to tell me that the Hebrew tradition has nothing to say or to counsel followers of Christ in order to stop 14 days of names, 15 days of names, to have been more cognizant early on and stopped 1 day of names. Like, our faith has nothing to say to stop that. Now, here I pause, and I want to be generous, because it's not as if most of our pacifist friends do nothing, right? They do things to try to limit violence and to peacemake and all that. I get it, and I get what they do. But there are times, as you said earlier, where you come to a moment of judgment. You're walking down the street and you see one neighbor kicking in the face of another neighbor. And prayer is not going to help at this point. We can pray, but prayer didn't end the Holocaust unless the answer to prayer was the 81st Airborne, right? That's just not how our world works. Romans 13 makes very clear. God gave us the government in order to punish evil, right? To right wrongs, to keep order. That is an answer to prayer. You've got to make judgments. You've got to act within history. And I see nothing in the Hebrew tradition that suggests that we stand idly by while our neighbors are carted off to their deaths. I just don't see it. I think it's a non-example of Christ. When you look at the Old Testament, you look at the Psalms, you look at the Proverbs, you look at Christ, the Lamb who is slain, who's going to come back at the end of time and judge the nations. I think Christ is a non-example of pacifism. And the only other thing I'll say, now that you got my dander up, is that, the pacifists act as if they are opposed to violence. And that's lovely. The just war tradition, not incidentally, has the same goal as pacifists, right? Peace. And if nonviolence will be just as effective as violence, great. We're going to go with nonviolence every day. That's baked into the system. But in a world in which the enemy has a vote, at the end of the day, it seems to me that the one thing pacifists are committed to is that good people don't use violence. Violence will only be used by the aggressors. And then the good people will respond with nonviolence or non-resistance or something else. And that seems insufficient, because mercy is always going to cost somebody something. The cross teaches us that. And when we show mercy to those who are kicking apart the innocent, then the innocent pay the costs of mercy. And I'm simply not willing to believe, because I don't see the witness, that's what our God demands of us.
If I could just follow up, because your story of visiting the death camps and that informing your view of just war from a Hebraic tradition, a lot of the images we saw coming out of Saturday, to me, were really reminiscent of videos I had seen in black and white in the interwar years leading up to the Holocaust and then during the Holocaust. So how does that kind of inform Israel's right to defend itself? I think there's a lot of questions arising. There's also a lot of moral equivalences that have been made, which, not to get too into the weeds, but this is a question I think that's come up is, Gaza is an apartheid state and Israel's been doing this for years and years and years. Therefore, a counter offensive is unjust for Israel to respond to the terror attacks on Saturday. Even Biden's initial tweet was calling for Israel to not resort to violence. So how do those innocent lives kind of inform Israel's right to defend itself at all through this just war tradition in that lens?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that you're highlighting is that you cannot look at present circumstances, and I know the sort of our interlocutors want to do the same thing, but you can't look at the present day without bringing history into it. Robert, I had the joy of traveling through Israel with you and Luke Moon and the rest of you guys during the we followed the 50th anniversary of the 6-Day War.
Yeah, must have been.
Mm-hmm. And there's an awful lot of things about traveling the land that is clarifying. And so I'm traveling the land for the first time, and I've got Holocaust rattling around in my mind. And I've got the recognition that time and time and time again, the world has failed the Jews. And the Jews have had to defend the Jews because nobody else would, or nobody else would early enough. And so the Jews have learned, we've got to protect ourselves. And then you go to the land and you stand on some of the disputed territories in the West Bank, and you're on what is hardly recognizable as a hill. But you get to the top of it and you realize, oh yeah, this is a hill. Oh, and from this hill, I could actually see several major highways, and there's the Mediterranean just there in the distance. Then you turn to one of the army guys and you say, so if I had just a man-packable weapon system, artillery piece, what could I hit from here? And he kind of, evaluates. He says, you could hit everything from here to the sea. Like, oh, well, they're never going to give this back, right? Not so long as their neighbors want to push them into that sea. You go to the west side of the Sea of Galilee and you look up on the Golan Heights. They're never going to give that back. They would be fools to give that back so long as their neighbors want to drive them into the sea. And history is going to play a part in that, right? The Allied movement survived the Battle of the Bulge in World War II because we could fall back, reposition, or, and then attack again. If Israel falls back ever, their feet are wet. Right? They're in the water. That's going to govern your choices. They can't get hit first. They got hit first. I guess they can technically, but right, they can't afford that. And history has to be playing in their minds. I don't think anybody can doubt. I think they did probably, when did this start? October 7th? I think on October 6th, a lot of observers maybe doubted that Hamas, if they could, would really kill another 6 million Jews. I think on October 8th, nobody doubts that. They might explain it away. They might justify it, but nobody doubts, I think, that Hamas has that ambition. It's in their charter. They should have read it. So yeah, history is indisputable. History is going to matter. That does not mean carte blanche. That does not mean now the Israelis can run roughshod over the human rights of everybody else. But it is going to factor in. It's a huge question right now about how justly you can fight a fight when your enemy fashions intentionally circumstances to make fighting a just war justly really difficult. It becomes a really big question.
And I think, speaking of history, I think it's also important to note that tradition or set of traditions was developed more or less in Europe, in a society that was largely, if not wholly, shaped by Christianity, by the Hebraic tradition undergirding Christianity. It presumed a certain base level of cultural, call it civilizational similarity.
Mm-hmm.
It assumed a base level of understanding of what war typically is, which up until World War I was really, princes and dukes and kings fighting out in fairly limited fashion, certain wars to obtain more resources or, avenge national honor, and then kind of go back to the way things were. And with industrialization, modernization, globalization, suddenly the world is in contact with every other part of the world. And these assumptions that led to the development of this tradition, right? Just giving it that historical context that you're talking about, I think presents some real challenges for the situation as it exists, right? I mean, you're kind of alluding to it, Mark. What do you do when the other side of a war isn't interested in negotiating? What do you do when they are sworn officially, formally, by, religious fiat to your destruction? And right. Furthermore, they're willing to do whatever is necessary to achieve that objective, including not only the sacrifice of your civilians, but their own.
Right.
Like, what do you do with that? How does the laws of war and how does the just war tradition even grapple with that? Right. I mean, it is, and these are questions that are not new. They've been asked throughout, since 2001 with the beginning of the global war on terror. So I want to maybe move us toward the current conflict here and just kind of ask you an open-ended question. What are you seeing right now? As you're a just war scholar, you are just steeped in this way of thinking. You see conflict break out on October 7th. You start to see the Israeli response. What are the questions and concerns that are popping up in your mind right now?
Right. Yeah. So good. So, in one sense, in the early stages of the Israeli response, maybe I should go even further back and not presume too much. There's the attack. Fine. Surprise attacks are appropriate. There is and actually I'm going to say this like a statement, Robert, but this should actually be a question. There is a state of war between Hamas and Israel on October 6th? Or does one presume that? I assume one presumes that, but clearly it's different than it is now. Now it's maybe it was tacit. Now it's articulated.
Mm-hmm.
But
tacit, periodically tacit, and of course it broke out into open war, every 2 years or so.
Yeah, right. So okay, they're not besties. We know this. So a surprise attack, okay, right? You could kind of say, well, you've got a long brewing, simmering campaign. You do what you need to do, but then you see the quality of that attack and the targets of that attack, right? There were a few military targets. There were a few, fine. The targets were civilians. It was the intentional murder of, 600, I can't remember on the day. But such a large number of civilians on the day that Jews have not seen that many civilians murdered since the Holocaust, right? That's saying something. That's sobering. So the targets are wrong. There is no warrant. I don't care what they have gone through in their past. That response is anathema. No matter what the moral framework that you're using to justify your actions, I simply think it's groundless to suggest that, the killing of children, whether you decapitated them or simply murdered them in some other way, is irrelevant. You've murdered children. You've murdered old people. You've murdered innocent civilians, intentionally so. They were the target of your attack. There's no grounds for that. And I, it seems most people have gotten that. Now you take hostages and you bring them back. If you've got soldiers and you've taken them back, somebody could argue, okay, that's a legitimate POW. We do that in war. But the vast majority of this 130 some odd group of hostages are not IDF. Now, I've heard the waffling say, well, every adult Israeli is, technically a soldier. That's going to get complicated quick. That's something that you could talk about and argue. But as you said, on the borders, there are people who are clearly not going to be combatants. You've got the infants, you've got the children, you've got the elderly, all of that. So that's kidnapping. That's not, and you're presumably kidnapping them for the sake of human shields or something else. All that's ghastly. You've got all that. So first of all, you've got the Israeli response, which in the early days, early hours, I suppose, appears entirely legitimate. You're fine with it. And then you get this very uncomfortable statement by Gallant, the minister, I believe, of defense, who says they're going to cut it all off. We're going to besiege Gaza. No electricity, no water, no food, nothing. And the just war ears sort of prick up. And you go back to trying to remember what it is you've read about siege warfare, which is a ghastly way of doing a ghastly business. So that was my first big sort of coming up short on the Israeli side of things, and really having to look into, okay, if that's what they're going to do, are there moral grounds for that? And immediately I had friends who asked me about it, like, can they do that? And one of my initial responses is, well, what are the questions we need to be asking? Like, one of the questions is, well, why is it that Israel is in a position to do all that, to cut off electricity, to cut off water, to cut off food? I thought Gaza was, a relatively independent state. It's got functioning government. It's got an elected government. This should be their business. I had said earlier, the proper authority is he or she over whom there is no one greater charged with the care of the political community. So it should be the sovereign responsibility of Hamas, I guess, is the I don't know if you can call them duly elected anymore. If my memory is correct, they were elected once and suspended elections. I guess that's how you could do it. But it's their job to provide electricity, food, and water to their people. Then I remember that the context is complicated, and I don't know if they've even got the possibilities of doing that. So that would be a question I would ask: is what are the possibilities for Hamas to be independent of Israel in those ways?
You're raising a lot of important questions. I heard Israeli philosopher, his name's Micha Goodman, very smart guy, on a podcast just a day or two ago. And he said something really interesting, which is that Israel is located between the West and the Islamic world, let's call it that, or the Arab world maybe. And Israel is pulled in its posture between a posture of love and wanting to be loved by the West primarily, to which it feels deep affinity, and a posture of fear and wanting to be feared by its Arab and Muslim neighbors to the south and east, right? You can't really do both effectively, right? Want to be loved, want to be feared. There's no doubt that the statements of Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, and some others coming from Israeli leaders are a kind of, I don't know if I can call them a psyop, but certainly a kind of messaging intended to intimidate otherwise intractable, religiously motivated actors to make decisions that will end the conflict sooner. The rationale, and now I'm channeling what I know about Israelis, the rationale is that to live in a tough neighborhood, you have to be tough. When you encounter a bully, you have to be a bigger and stronger bully. And if Hamas is willing to do what it did, really take, or spare no effort to wreaking as much human catastrophe as possible, then you need to be really, really tough. And they need to feel that if they don't give up these hostages and surrender, things are going to get much, much worse. Now, when we hear those things in English, right, it doesn't play well on our ears because of our cultural context, our history, our, explicit or latent Christian impulses to love the neighbor and turn the other cheek. But it is a very conscious kind of messaging that is geared toward, and I'd say, an Arabic language audience. I just put it like that. Does it excuse the kind of language? No, but I do think it points to the fact, especially given the history of the IDF and its conflicts in the past, that the IDF may not be as, I don't know, bloodthirsty, I guess you could say, as it otherwise appears. The alternative is, of course, a massive ground invasion of Gaza, which will, and I think this comes back to this whole question of decision making, and I'll stop here and give it back to you, Mark, of, so what do you do? That's really, to me, always the question. Everybody has their preferences, and boy, it would be nice if we had peace, but we don't. We're in this particular situation in this moment in time. Right. What are the options in front of us? One of the options is Hamas surrenders, its leadership surrenders, they give back the hostages, the war is over today. Yep. The other options are massive airstrikes that are intended to weaken Hamas leadership until they do what I just said, surrender, give up the hostages, or try to accomplish that objective by launching a massive ground invasion. Now, we know from Iraq, from Afghanistan, the catastrophic toll of urban warfare. It's almost always been the case historically that when confronted with the option of laying siege or going into a densely populated city, armies tend to prefer the former. So I said this the other day, I don't envy anyone who has to make this decision. It's an incredibly difficult decision. The rhetoric is hard to hear, but I understand where it's coming from. I do want to ask you about analogies to what we're seeing now, maybe things that you've encountered before. But before I do, Mark, anything more on that, or I mean, even what I said? What do you think?
You said a lot. You said a lot. One of the things I think you're starting off with this reminder, like that most of political life is about making judgments, and you can only make judgments with the facts as you have them, and you might be wrong. You can only make judgments in light of what you understand the context to be, and you're not entirely responsible for the context, right? I think if there's something that when we were on our trip for the 6-Day War, we met with Michael Oren, who used to be ambassador to the United States. At the time, he was a minister of something. He said something that has stuck with me that I know a lot of people push back on, but I think they are wrong. He said, I start every sort of debate about the Middle East with the following aphorism. If the Palestinians lay down their arms, there will be peace with Israel. If Israel lays down their arms, there will be no Israel. And I think we can start with that, right? And that's the option that they know they have, right? So they have to begin with that. That seems key. The analogies question, I think there's a lot of them. I think, as you described the conundrum in how do you respond to the prospect of invading Gaza, of striking it from the air, of besieging it, of trying in some way to be discriminate and separate, the combatants from the non-combatants while you do any of those options. How do you not kill your own people who they've brought in to shield themselves while you do any of those options? One of the things that comes to mind is the book I'm now perpetually, but book I'm writing on Hiroshima, right? Because these are a lot of the same questions. You've got a culture that doesn't respect our understanding of what it means to fight a right fight rightly, right? Japan knew they were beaten in the summer of 1944. We had the radio intercepts. They admitted this in their diplomatic channels, but they still wanted to continue the fight so that our actually bringing it to a close would be so bloody that we would give them terms that were more preferable to them, which included holding territories that they had conquered and no war crime tribunals, all sorts of things that we would never have agreed to. But they knew they had been beaten. And how do you fight a fight when you've fought it as rightly and as decisively as you can? You've brought it to a known conclusion, and your enemy's recognition of their defeat doesn't translate into surrender. Like, what are you supposed to do?
Great question.
So now we're facing this prospect. Well, we can besiege you. You're an island. We can starve you out. We can invade you. We can continue with the aerial bombardment. So it's not almost at all unlike what we're facing in Gaza. Or we can drop this hideous new weapon and maybe end this thing quickly. So it's the same kinds of questions they're asking in the South Pacific in the summer of 1945 as I think we're asking now. I think one of the other things that you said that I didn't say that needs to be highlighted is that it wasn't simply no electricity, no food, no water. That's it. You're done. It's very clearly, it's been articulated to Hamas leadership, unless you give the hostages back.
Yes. So
you've given them a way out. You've asked for a morally legitimate requirement, and the starvation stops. Right? Once Gallant announced that, or whoever it was that announced that, my problems, my tensions with this idea of such an indiscriminate weapon as total embargo, a lot of that dries up because Hamas can end this in a moment, right? 5 minutes from now, we could be done with at least that aspect of the campaign. So, it's in their court. You're a Marine, Robert. One of the greatest of all Marines, General Mattis. He faced a similar situation, I think, when faced with the prospect of clearing Fallujah of fighters in, March, I think, of 2004. That had every reason, to be a hideous fight. The U.S. military encircled it, so they put it under siege. They had the option of letting people out. They made announcements saying families, civilians, anybody who doesn't want to be in this fight, leave. And they had checkpoints, and they prevented any military age male from leaving unless they were accompanying family members. So they had a way of vetting. So this is all leading to a question. They could encircle it. They could demand that people leave. They could vet at least the fighting age people who were leaving, let them leave. And now Fallujah should be technically only full of fighters. Now, there are some people who can't leave, the infirm, the elderly, people like that. So we still have to be careful. But then they go in a ground assault, and they could take it neighborhood by neighborhood, secure that neighborhood, bring some sense of order and security. And then if there were civilians still there, they could tend to them. They could supply them. They could give them medical care, whatever it is they needed. They could get them out. As you slowly begin to make your way through, and I think they did it in a pincer, but as you slowly make your way through the city. But even that was an option, right? They could have just leveled the city from the beginning, and not jeopardized in any significant way a single American life. But instead, we still go door to door to door to door in order to be as discriminate and proportionate as we can. I think Mattis's approach to Fallujah, until it got scuttled by the politicians, was flawless. And so then I take that and I map that onto what we see in Gaza. And now I've got all kinds of questions. Like, one of the things that ought to be done is to give permission to those who don't want to be in the fight to leave. And I'm muddled on this. I've heard that request or that caution was made that, civilians should leave. So now I turn this over to you. What are the options for civilians in Gaza to leave? You noted earlier that, Gaza is a rectangle. One side's the sea, two of the sides is Israel, but one side goes into Egypt. So open the door to Egypt, all the innocent leave, and now we've got a city full of fighters. Isn't that easy? So what's the problem?
Is complicated by two things. So Netanyahu actually did advise Palestinians in Gaza that there would be retaliation and to leave via the Rafah border crossing into Egypt. Israel actually ended up targeting it with missiles because it was being used to smuggle in weapons. So you have that question of, how does that fit into then their defense or their counter defense calculation of, okay, now weapons are being used to be transported in through that crossing. How does that then increase future casualties? So that enters into their calculation. And also Egypt doesn't want Palestinians coming from Gaza into Egypt. They have rejected the notion of taking them as refugees of the conflict. So then there's this other complicated question of, how does that fit into Israel's war calculus? And then what do you do when Egypt calls for a peaceful end, which really means Israel doing nothing, but doesn't want to help on the humanitarian front? So those are just some larger context, but also it complicates Israel's calculation.
Right. So, again, as Robert stressed, I've got to make a decision, and I can't set the terms in which I make that decision, right? Some of these terms are being forced upon me. And so, I continually do the best that I can, the most discriminate that I can be, the most proportionate that I can be. But if you're building headquarters under hospitals or you're shielding yourself with children, there's still a fight that has to be fought.
Let me ask you, Mark, because you mentioned proportionality, and you and I have talked about this. It's been a long time. I want to bring it back to the front because it's inevitably the word that comes up in any of these, wars, conflicts between Israel and Hamas over these past 10 years. The response of Israel to Hamas attacks, always unprovoked, always aimed at civilians, mind you, is that Israel's response is disproportionate. Now, we know what that means, that, you don't bring a bazooka to a knife fight, right? It's not fair. You bring a knife to a knife fight, and that gives, that makes an even playing field. It's a very simplistic way to put it, but there is an argument out there, and I have to say, and I'm not a scholar of these things, but an argument out there that says proportionality in principle is correct. It is wrong to, kill someone for looking at you the wrong way. having said that, in times of war, isn't it possible that restraint is precisely what prolongs these kinds of conflicts, and that a definitive end, see Hiroshima, to a conflict, overwhelming power that forces in short order a posture of submission upon the enemy, is actually much more preferable than long drawn out conflicts. This idea, mowing the grass and then it grows back and then there's another conflict and more people die and then we cease fire and then there's another conflict and more people die, et cetera, et cetera. The argument out there from some people is that the whole just war thing sounds fine, sounds right, I'm in, but this proportionality thing, when stretched and misapplied, actually leads to more war. What do you think about that?
I think 100% on board. I think you could draw a bright line between the Treaty of Versailles that supposedly ended World War I and Hiroshima, right? So you've got Versailles, in which everybody agrees to an armistice. Not everybody agreed to the armistice. General Pershing, the U.S. commander, was furious with the idea, and he begged the Americans and the Brits and the French to not do this. He said, the Germans don't know that they have lost this fight. Give me another week and I can lick them. And they need to know they've been licked because the fight needs to be taken out of them. And that is a kind of, over the long term, a kind of grace to help your enemy know that this fight is done and you can stand down. We have records of German generals telling their troops to march home to Germany, which has never seen war in World War I, never visited the German homeland. German generals telling their troops, we can march home with our heads high because we are surrendering on enemy-occupied territory, right? They were never defeated in the field decisively. And that gave rise to the ability for certain people to say we were stabbed in the back, and we just, all that we had was a pause in the fighting to raise another generation of young men to feed to the cannon fodder. And it's not, I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of the people who made the decisions in World War II were young men in World War I who saw what an indecisive victory can lead to. And so they said, no, this is going to be unconditional. And if you don't know you've lost the fight, you will know soon. So I think decisiveness is important. And so proportionality is not, you've killed 12 of mine, I'm going to kill 12 of yours. Proportionality has to be a calculus that's made with, what is my war aim? Here's what victory looks like for me. Is what I'm doing proportionate to that war end? Modified by, only doing the amount that's necessary to achieve this end. But Robert Kaufman, who's a professor over at Pepperdine, who's a great guy, he once used the phrase in a Providence article. He's talking about proportionality and decisiveness. And he said, you only use the amount of force necessary to achieve your ends. But as with cancer surgery, we want to err on the side of wide margins. So it's not like you cut out just enough. You're going to take a little bit more than you need to make sure you got the whole thing so you don't have to go back in later. And you cut a little more away than you might need. But in the long term, that's a grace. And so I think Israel right now, their proportionate response to what has happened is to do whatever is necessary to make sure that Hamas never again has the capacity and ideally the will to kill Jews.
Absolutely. Mark, I want to ask you to share with listeners where they can find your work, find your writing, and maybe any other resources that you might point them to, especially if this is maybe the first time they've stumbled across this kind of thinking when it comes to war.
Yeah. The one spot that I should point them to first is providencemag.com. All right. You had a lot to do with starting that up, Robert. And there's a lot of good resources. I think if you type in Just War and providencemag.com, you'll find a bunch of resources on Just War. I've started a series called Just War 101. And so if you put that into quotes, Just War 101, Providence Magazine, I think my page will come up. And it's some of it's deep into the weeds, but it there's an overview, and then it walks you through, what are the various components of just war thinking. We've got a bunch of cases on there. We did an issue, I think, on the 6-Day War, with a lot of good resources just about the Middle East. Interview from Michael Warren. I think you've got an article in there. So good resources on all of that. Those are probably the first places I would go. Some of the other names that people could look up, Nigel Biggar, Biggar. He's done some good stuff on Just War recently, very good. James Turner Johnson is sort of the historian of Just War thinking. You can find a lot of his stuff online. Some of that's a little bit more into the weeds than others, but those are some good resources, I think.
Thank you so much. I'll definitely be looking that up. I think I can speak for the voice of our younger audience who I wasn't familiar with just war theory, but it provides a lot of context to some of the questions or some of the anti-Israel propaganda we've seen a lot in the Western media. So thank you very much for that context.
No, it's a pleasure. I mean, it's important to remember. I mean, you'll hear as I've heard it in your voice, and when you and Luke did the first sort of response to all of this, you'll hear the emotion, right? Just war is not holy war, right? It's not simply the righteous against the unrighteous. We're human beings. We are all a collection of good and evil, runs straight through the heart. We know that. And so this is a moral apparatus for flawed human beings to figure out how to deal with other flawed human beings. And there should be no joy in it, right? We would much rather do just about anything than kill each other.
It's I think a very important note to end on. I've had some comments on various posts I've made on Twitter from people feeling the need to say what to me is kind of obvious, but needs to be said, which is that we deplore and oppose the death of civilians in combat. I mean, that's, to me, extremely obvious. There's nothing more tragic than seeing photos of dead people, period, right? I don't care if they're Jewish or Muslim or Christian. And I think as Christians, the first step, I always teach this when I talk about, proper Christian response to conflict, first step is compassion, right? It's, to me, the obvious starting point for anyone who believes that all human beings are made in the image of God and that we are one human family, right? We're a lot of, messed up cousins here on this rock, but we are a family, and we do, of course, I mean, as Philos, absolutely would be deeply hurt by the killing of civilians. But again, it comes down to making decisions. And I'll tell you what, if I woke up at 6:30 in the morning and my neighbor climbed my fence, killed my spouse, kidnapped my 2 children, maybe raped one of them on the way, and then brought them back to his house, surrounded his property with, guys on turrets with guns, I'm gonna have to make some hard choices, right? And there's no easy way out of that. He's not giving him back. He did it because he thinks God wanted him to do that. And I have to make the decisions I have to make. And I would urge anybody out there who's quick to go on social media or even engage in conversation with friends and, very casually, explain how one goes about liberating hostages and destroying the organization, the terror organization that kidnapped them, to just maybe pause and think about being in that position, sitting in that chair, having to make that call where not only innocent civilians die, but your own people who've already suffered, right? Israeli soldiers. You think these mothers and fathers want to send their kids into Gaza? It's like, to say Gaza is like Vietnam or Iraq for an American. So just be humble and be glad and thank God that you are not sitting in that position, having to make that decision.
No, that's right. If I could just add one little piece to this, not to make this any more complicated than it is, but the simple recognition that Israel has to be really careful how they respond to the hostage situation. And they know this, because if you respond in one way, then you have now incentivized people to steal your children. And so you can't give them a business plan. Unfortunately, the Biden administration's deal with Iran, where we released the $6 billion, gave our enemies a business plan. If you want to get flush, steal an American, right? We can't do that. And I know they've got this Hannibal doctrine, or they supposedly have the Hannibal doctrine, and it's this opaque thing. But that is a real world ghastly apparatus for making ghastly decisions. And so I think there's a whole lot more horror that's going to come around. And I wish none of it on anybody.
Mark, I want to thank you and reserve the right to bring you back as this situation unfolds. No doubt there'll be a lot more questions being raised about the conflict, and would love to have you be our guide. Appreciate you.
No, I appreciate what you guys do. I am continually impressed with the real nuanced care you try to give. And I think that's evidenced in the circle of friends you have who are on both sides of this conflict right now, and some straight in the middle of it. So I love that you guys do what you do and how you do it.
Thank you, Mark.